Salvete omnes ad capitulum septimum. Welcome everybody to chapter 7. Moving right along. In this chapter, we have Cornelius seated at a desk by the pool. Nice, if you can get one. Also, we have a messenger shows up. You can see him here. He's got a horse and sort of like a little chariot looking thing. We'll see more about that in a future chapter. Types of vehicles. It's kind of cool. But the messenger shows up and he greets the kids, Cornelia and Marcus, and that little twerp Sextus right here. And he's looking for Cornelius, who is writing at a desk, and there's some urgent news. Isn't that what this is called? Oh, news from Rome. Okay. So this chapter is going to put our family in motion on a trip to Rome. If you remember, they are now down at the Bay of Naples, their summer place, their villa, vacationing for the moment from all the hot affairs of the city, and they are now going to be called back to Rome on urgent business. So that's a little bit of a precursor or a sort of intro to the chapter story wise. And then we have, of course, the inevitable grammar stuff. So we talk about plural direct object endings. You've seen singular direct objects, but now you're going to see plural direct objects. And we're going to be introduced to the idea of cases and declensions, two of the most hated words in the English language for those who have taken Latin. I feel like I'm doing a bad job of selling Latin as a good thing in this. I'm acknowledging that it has some difficulties, but I'm encouraging you to take them on always. Because, with anything that is worth doing, it takes effort. So, cases and declensions apply to nouns. You'll see that this book sort of goes back and forth between, we'll work on nouns a little this chapter, and then we'll do verbs a little next chapter, and sort of alternate, go back and forth. So this one will be heavy on nouns, and that's where cases and declensions are applied to nouns, not to verbs, but to nouns. And then to relieve some of the enormous strain and pressure that grammar in Latin puts upon us, we'll have some easier sort of cultural cool stuff about a Roman villa, and then some of the very ancient history, which is in history of Rome, which is kind of enshrouded in myth. This fellow named Aeneas, who was covered previously in another chapter. I believe, unless I'm misremembering this now, but he leaves from Troy after the collapse of Troy, after it is destroyed by the deception of the Greeks and the Trojan horse and all that. Aeneas leaves and goes on many journeys, just like Odysseus or Ulysses did. And this is all detailed in a book by a guy named Virgil, and his famous epic poet is called the Aeneid, the story of Aeneas. So a little bit more about Aeneas too. But first we get to hard work, which is the grammar of this chapter. So again, direct objects and a big one, noun cases and declensions. I left declensions out here. Make sure that's in there. Declensions. They are different. They need to be identified what they are, because you're going to be seeing a lot of them. Okay, first we'll get to the easier thing. We've seen singular direct objects. Direct objects. You've seen these, and now you're going to be seeing the plural forms of those. So since we are broaching the subject of declensions in this chapter, I'm going to indicate what declensions each of these nouns are now. Okay, so Ankilam is the slave woman, and this is the singular form when she is a direct object, and this is the plural form when they are the direct object. Same thing goes for slave. We have This is so again. This is feminine, and most feminine nouns are said to be of the first declension. Declension, as you'll see, is really just a fancy word for a group a group of nouns that have similar characteristics. So, ankylam, ankylas, servum in its singular form becomes servos in its plural, and these are many masculine and neuter nouns appear in the second declension and second group, if you want to keep it simple. And then the third declension, which is a little bit more challenging because it has feminine, masculine, and neuter forms all over the place. We have senator M, or say vocem, and we have senator ace. Now this should be, excuse me, that should be a long E there. So we have this as, os, and ace endings for plural direct objects depending on what group or declension of nouns they come from. Just some quick examples. No need to really go over this too much because the real topic for this chapter is cases, but Marcus videt ankylam, one slave girl here, ankylas, plural, more slave girls here. So Marcus sees the slave girl, or Marcus sees the slave girls. Notice that these are functioning like direct objects. Marcus is the subject. He's doing a particular action to a particular person. He is seeing the slave girl or the slave girls. Likewise, for slave, we have servum singular, servos plural here. Now Marcus sees the slave, or Marcus sees the slaves. And then finally, Marcus, in his quest to see all things, sees a senator, or he sees senators. So notice they end with M in its singular, in the singular forms, and they end with S in the plural forms. Now, that's not a bad rule of thumb, but let's also never forget that, that word right there, servos, is a singular subject. So because it ends with an S does not mean at all that it's a plural as a rule in Latin. So I've noticed that people tend to think that this is slaves because it has an S at the end, like we do, right? Why isn't Latin just like English? What's wrong with it? Why doesn't it get its act together? So that's direct objects. Now, to get to the larger matter, we have the idea of cases. I'm going to get rid of all this stuff that came above now so we can keep this more organized. Noun cases, as I say, pay attention to this one. This is not a place to sort of fall asleep, although you may be tempted to, because everyone loves grammar so much, but it tends to put people to sleep. So what is a case? A case is, well, how have I said it here? A Latin noun and any adjectives that describe it can be in a variety of cases, depending on how that noun functions in its sentence. And what do I mean by that? I mean, hey, it's a noun. What, does it have only one function, to be a person, place, or thing? No, it doesn't. It's going to function in a variety of ways in any given sentence. And I say, just think of this distinction between a subject and a direct object. So if a noun is a subject, like Marcus sees the senator, Marcus is the subject. Marcus is in a particular case, and he's that way because he's the subject. But if it's the other way around, and the senator sees Marcus, Marcus is now a direct object, and his name is going to have a different ending now, and he's going to be in a different case now. So two of these cases are introduced in this chapter. And the first one is called nominative, and the second one is called accusative. You'll see that they all end with T-I-V-E. There are 6 cases total in Latin, 5 big ones and one that is sort of less of a big deal. And they all really are, they all basically cover different ways that a noun and any adjectives that describe them can function in a sentence. There are basically 5 main cases that sort of describe that relationship between a noun and the rest of the parts of its sentence. So Nominative case is, as I say, mostly for subjects of sentences. That's like the 9 out of 10 rule there. There are also things called complements, which were covered, which is another core element of Latin sentences. Complement is something. Well, I'm not gonna muddy the issue right now. Let's just say that nominative is mostly for subjects. And the accusative case is used mostly for direct objects, but it does have some other uses as well. So don't hold me to just direct objects because it gets a little bit more complicated and involved than that. But we're going to go slow with just these two cases. Now, why do students hate cases so much? It's really because we don't really employ them in our own language. We don't use them in English, but they do actually still exist in some ways. Now, here are two ways that we have whatever kind of like the remnants of what are called cases, or what were cases in Latin. We still have them. I mean, some languages do use cases, like German uses cases, probably in a less sophisticated way than Latin does. And some don't, but they all languages have the same concepts, like the way nouns function in sentences. They just don't use an elaborate case system the way that Latin does. But anyway, now Joe has think of how we show possession. Joe is in possession of a venomous snake. He owns it. He possesses it. It is his snake. So how do we show that it belongs to Joe? And we put this apostrophe s at the end of his name. So that's kind of a change there. You know, that's an example of how a case works. A change at the end of a word to show something in particular. Here, to show possession. This also works for Beth's gold mirror and the president's hostile glare. In each of the above phrases, we have added something, an apostrophe and the letter S, to the person's name or job to show possession. Another example would be this. Think of the fact that I and me both refer to the person in the mirror, but are used differently depending on the context or the usage of those words in sentences. So I is always a subject, right? We don't say you like I and me like you. You say I like you and you like me. So you could say that I is a kind of a nominative form. It's clearly a subject. And you could say that me is kind of an accusative form. It's mostly or very often used as a direct object in a sentence, as in you like me. Me is a direct object. So Latin just does this thing of using different forms depending on contexts on steroids, as I say. It just uses it a lot more. It's more elaborate than it is in English, and this is one of the things that makes it more challenging for some students. But it can be learned. It's not enormously difficult. It just takes a little bit of practice, and you should not be giving up. You should just embrace the reality of cases now, and we'll get to know them sort of one at a time, or in this chapter 2 at a time. Since we've been introduced to the idea of subjects and direct objects, we're going to be introduced to the nominative and the accusative case. Okay, I've talked forever. I'm going to leave it alone there, and in the next video I will attempt to look at some of the exercises that are due. Okay, bye.